Good afternoon. My name is Enrico Palandri. I'm a professor of modern European literature at University College London, and I also teach at Ca' Foscari in Venice. And I'm going to give you a lecture on the landscape around the teaching of humanities. I'm going to share my screen with some slides to give you an itinerary of what we'll be talking about. So let's start. These are the points that I'm going to cover. What is human, the cultural and intellectual development, and nature, these three key concepts for understanding what is humanities, the fracture between science and humanities, and today's landscape and teaching. So let's start with the word homo, humus, from where humanities come from. The word homo, which means man, from where humanities comes from, is strongly connected to the word humus, which is the word for earth, land, and it's connected to the myth that we have in the Bible of man, Adam, the first man, being in fact made of earth by God. And the same idea, we find it in a different tradition, which is the Latin one. But what we are concerned with mostly today is the idea of, so what is this piece of earth? What is this man? What is around which the study of humanities is centered? Exactly like with earth, we can cultivate, we can have a culture of what is man. And by digging different epoch or different geographical eras, we can, in geographical areas, we can confront different ideas, and we can try and gain an idea of what is humanities today. So I'll start today with the Roman and Christian civilization, which is at the core of what is today called the Western civilization, although where humanities are, the studies of humanities as we intended in this university is large, which is mainly the study of literature, philosophy, poetry, history, and try and understand how we come to an understanding of what is human. So this is the area where the Latin word had an influence. And as you can see, it included most of Europe and what is called today the Middle East and the beginning of Asia, in an epoch where there were fundamentally four empires, the Roman, the Persian, the Indian, and the Chinese, one next to the other. And we'll focus on the idea that spreads around this area between the 27 and the 476 AD means Anno Domini, which means the year of the god in the Christian tradition. But today we refer to these very often as common era because of the influence that this civilization has had in different parts of the world. So this is when it was all together, and I wanted to show you in these first 450 years after the birth of Christ, according to the Christian tradition, but we could also say the transformation of the Roman civilization, which concerned mainly Italy, into an area which spoke and traded through Latin and Greek, which was a previous and contemporary civilization in these other part of the world. And it's not always been like that. When the Western Roman Empire will collapse, this is the situation that we will have, as you see, with a lot of little states. Even Italy is fractured in many different states. This is in Dante's time. Dante was born in 1265, and he writes his most influential work about the year 1300, so when he's 35 years old. And it's probably the moment in which we can join the classical world with our understanding of the modern world, because Dante is affected by the great classical literature that has been written, particularly in Latin. He didn't read Greek, but the Latin word had absorbed a lot of the Greek influences, and the world that we know today, which will actually have a country like England and France and so on and so forth. So the way in which I want to show you this idea of humanities through this fresco, which is in Rome. I warmly recommend you to go and visit San Clemente, which is a little church behind the Colosseum. The Colosseum was like a big stadium where, in fact, they had games, and very cruel games at times. When it opened, they apparently killed some 5,000 convicts for the entertainment of the Roman crowd. This little church, and churches were mainly the administrative hubs of the communities, where you had both public registers, you had the law, you had the bond of the communities. And these, unfortunately, it's not a very good slide, but I can show here we have Sisino, who is an old pagan. Pagans come from pagus, which means village, the people who lived in the most remote areas. And the story is that Sisino's wife had become a Christian, had become a follower of the ideas of Christ. And here is very interesting because we have an acronym in, an acrostic in Latin, and the vignettes, which is like a graphic novel, are in Italian, in a very, very early form of Italian. So the story is that the wife of Sisino had turned Christian, and Sisino, not believing in Christianity, was convinced that it was actually the body itself of Saint Clement to perform miracles and to have magical powers. It's something that seems rather remote to us, but throughout the Middle Ages, we will have these cult of dead bodies, of relics of dead bodies. And in fact, it's something that will carry through to the modern age. If you think that in the Red Square in Moscow, we have the body of Lenin, on Tiananmen Square in Beijing, we have the body of Mao Zedong. The idea that a body has a power for the people of that community is something that it seems remote, but it's not so remote after all. The interesting story, the miracle, so to speak, that is performed by St. Clement, is that when he tells his slaves to go and get the body of St. Clement, the body is turned into a pillar, as you can see, and therefore it becomes very heavy to carry. And the captions here in Italian says, traite, Albertel, trai, you see where I'm pointing here. And here is saying, traite, traiti, file della puta. Sasino is saying, drag it, son of bitches. And Albertel, valiti dietro colo palo, go with a piece of wood to try and move it. But the body has become too heavy because it has become a pillar of stone. The moral motto says, duritiam cordis vestris, saxa traere meruistis. which means because of the hardness of your heart, you deserve to drag stones. And which means literally the description of what is happening. Because you're not Christian and your heart is hard, you deserve to drag stones. But it also has a metaphorical meaning or an allegorical meaning, meaning not a literal meaning, that refers to the virtue of Christianity, according to this tradition, which is because you do not know love and you do not know forgiveness, you were obliged to drag stones. So humanities, in a way, is the sense that at the center of human beings, according to this tradition, the Roman Empire will collapse in 476, but Europe will become Christian, which is also the administration of and what gels and keeps together Europe for at least the following 10 centuries, and then to a certain extent, you know that the Pope is still very, very important and a powerful figure, and because he administrates this legacy, the legacy of what is human. These will come to a, I'll stop sharing now, becomes a very important center of what we think humans are. Humans are people who are endowed of love, of compassion, and therefore a sense of community and solidarity. And to read poetry, to read philosophy, to read history is the way in which we try and understand how what we mean today with the words love, with the words, with the cult that we have around our dear ones when they are deceased, about death and grieving, all these becomes very important if we are able to deepen our understanding through an understanding of the past, where these ideas come from, how they developed, and why they become what they are. A very important moment. I will just spend a couple of words on the importance of these understanding. If you think, for instance, of the word love, in Dante, that we mentioned before, because he writes this very central poem in the 1300, the Divine Comedy. In Dante, the idea of love is not something sentimental and private. It's based on an Aristotelian. Aristotle was a very important Greek philosopher who had a huge influence throughout this part of the world that I'm describing. And his idea was that, as you know, the earth for the people before the Copernican revolution, before we start believing that the sun is at the center of our system, of the solar system, before that, and Dante is included in the number of the people who believe this, the earth was at the center of this system and had the moon, the sun, and the other planets of the solar system orbiting around it. The way in which it worked, it was that this center, that in Aristotle is called the immobile mover, because it stands still, but it moves everything around it, is that the earth is attracted by the stars around it, and the stars are attracted to the earth. And this attraction, which is the same attraction of the same nature that we feel for one another as human beings, is love. Therefore, Dante repeats, l'amor che muove il sole, le altre stelle, love that moves the star and the sun, is not simply a metaphor. It's describing the way he sees the world around it, because the world is intimately inhabited animated. Anima is in fact what we have inside us, animated by something that is immaterial and is our bond with nature and reality and what we have around us. All this comes to a crisis when the first observations about the nature of the cosmos arise with Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo. And it's a great revolution, which we discover that through the observation, through the use of lenses and the binoculars and the first instruments that we built to observe the stars, we discover that it is not true that the Earth is the center of the universe, but in fact that it is orbiting the sun. Now, these will provoke a great fracture in our cultural tradition, because there will be a rejection of the tradition that has come, of the cultural tradition that has come through Christianity, which is very, very old. It comes from before Roman times. And the way we think about the cosmos today is called the scientific revolution, and will oppose to this tradition that comes through myths, basically, is discarded. And already by the end of the 18th century, the teaching of the church in these matters appear peripheral. But this will create other problems. First of all, on how do we relate, therefore, to a world that believed some things that were probably wrong, but also things that we are in need of in order to understand the world around us. And the way we understand this is through an empirical and factual understanding of reality. And the whole development of science, of the search for knowledge through empirical facts and proofs and calculations, is a great road that we will follow. And in a way, these will put the attention of humanity on a different level, because science cannot put itself historical, philosophical, poetical, or moral questions. They are all outside of the realm of its competence. You cannot ask a physician what is the meaning of the soul, because it's not part of the problems. Or you can ask him this question privately as an individual, but in his abilities as a researcher, the question of the soul just does not arise. And this will create a fracture that is very well pointed out in 1952 in a lecture by an English writer called C.P. Snow, where he will talk about two cultures. He teaches in Cambridge, and he says that there are people who are very competent in the relativity theory by Einstein and other very important ideas in physics, and know nothing about Shakespeare or Dante, and vice versa. You may have specialists in Dante and Shakespeare who know nothing about science, so that you have almost two worlds that are separated. And this is what creates, and this is the point that I wanted to come, the kind of landscape in which the teaching of humanities is inserted today. So on one side, we have a scientific approach also to language, history, and poetry that tries to make it factual. And on the other side, we have this great humanistic tradition where, of course, we have to understand people of the past or of other part of the world, because indeed mythologies exist throughout the planet who do not address this question from a scientific point of view. For instance, what do we think of death? How do we handle grief? And although there has been a continuous attempt to try and capture through science the realm of humanity, it's impossible to address these questions without somehow involving ourselves with some of the questions that people like Dante put to himself and to his epoch. So this creates a landscape around the teaching of humanities, which is always centered on our understanding of the world through the human being as the center of our attention, and therefore the poetry that he has written and the way he approached history or philosophy, these kind of questions. This creates a problem and a conflict in which very often the humanities appear to be peripheral to our understanding of the world. In other words, you can study cancer and actually have lengthened the life of someone who is ill, who has cancer. You cannot have similar achievements by studying history or philosophy or humanities in general. But at the same time, if we understand the compassion that we have for one another, the problems that we put ourselves in front of, migrations of people who flee starvation, or indeed the very central question that the earth probably could do very well without human beings, but human beings cannot renounce understanding and trying to address the questions that arise from our inhabiting the planet, and therefore questions like climate change, or more simply, what do we have to think of nature and human cultures, and human cultures in the sense that I meant before, the complex systems of ideas and behavior and politics that are they're like a boiling pot in which things from the past keep resurfacing and taking new shape, and relationship with our neighbors keep being readdressed and so on. Without an understanding of humanities, we are like blind. We are immersed in a world of data that really do not address the questions that arise for each one of us when, for instance, our parents die, or when we fall in love with someone. And of course, there are material, empirical things that we could say about that. We could say that we fall in love because we have to reproduce, and say that that is the end of it. But this is not really true, because in our longing, in our pining, is exactly poetry and literature that teaches us how to articulate who we are and what we think. Or in front of bereavement, when we lose somebody that we love very much, the way we can understand what is happening is again through poetry and philosophy and reasoning on these things. Well, I want to conclude saying just two things. One, that of course the landscape of humanities is now surrounded by many disciplines that are very, very useful to our understanding of reality and how we live. We study very carefully the way biology works, or the cosmos works, or physics works, and that they postulate, they assume that that is the reality. And on the other side, the care for the human being, which instead unavoidably puts questions that are unanswerable, particularly if you do not accept organized religion. And the way the teaching of humanities has changed is that it's been invaded by a number of ideologies and politics that always tries to link what we think of human beings with all the questions that the ethical questions, meaning the questions of the point of view from where we are and how we judge the world, that are in constant transformation. What I think, in my experience, having taught many years, and I've had so many students, that it's really lively and beautiful in the teaching of humanities is the humans themselves. Students are who approach this discipline, either because they are cores of another culture and therefore their language, but a language is not just a language, it's what it conveys, and therefore the habits, the customs, the mores, the way of thinking of those people. How do we understand Chinese people, and how do Chinese people understand us? Has a lot to do with trying to reconstruct and trying to cultivate what makes an Italian, what makes a Frenchman, what makes a Chinese, what makes a Russian, what makes an African, what is the system of beliefs that in fact are embodied in that language. And therefore, I think that the teaching itself is the most beautiful example of how humanities work. It's not just the transmission of data and information, but it's exactly the opposite. It's cultivating that kind of knowledge that will enhance the ability of the human to understand the world around us. So a beautiful example, and to conclude, is a myth. It's a story told by Plato, where he teaches one of the slaves to remember one mathematical theorem by Pythagoras, as if he already had, the slave already had that kind of knowledge. It really needs just to be drawn out. And I always felt like that with my students, that they know what is love, they know what is grief. And by helping them to read texts, and understand what is reading and understanding what is understanding, we help them to develop as human beings. Thank you. I hope you enjoyed this little talk. Bye-bye.